Jonathan, the platform is yours.
Well, let me, maybe I can say something, well, just quickly on the waste subject. Without further ado, I would just say that it's kind of a basic principle of mine is that don't do anything on Earth that will last 250,000 years. That's my feeling. So if somebody wants to propose that, my answer to them is call me back in a few thousand years and tell me when you've got a site that you've put the stuff in and there's been no earthquake and no water leaching through it and so on. But I won't get into that too much. Anyway, let me say it's wonderful to be here. I'm a little bit overawed by the setting and the technology, not to mention the technology, splendid or otherwise. And we're here to discuss a world free of nuclear weapons, and I'm fairly bursting with thoughts on that subject, but I'm actually going to put it a little bit to the side because I think perhaps the best thing I can do in this kind of introductory or invocatory position that I'm in here at the beginning of the conference is to do something a little different. And what I'd like to do is to try to situate, just say a few words situating the nuclear dilemma in two ways. One in terms of its own history, which is quite a long history by now, and second, in the much broader context today of new issues that have arisen. So I want to try to sort of catch us up in the present moment in a kind of reflective way. We are in the 7th decade of the nuclear age. As you know, on July 16th of 1945 was the date when the first nuclear weapon was set off at Alamogordo, New Mexico. And then on August 6th of that same year, the first bomb was used in anger over Hiroshima. And it was very sobering and wonderful to hear Mayor Akiba and the marvelous things he's doing in direct response to that. Scarcely anything could be more important, as I said before. Anyway, since then, the riddle of the bomb, which is pretty much at the same time the riddle of human survival, has really baffled us, baffled the world, I would say. People have pondered it, worried about it, protested it, fallen in love with it, from time to time gotten obsessed with it, and most of all forgotten about it. And probably the most striking episode of forgetting about it was at the end of the Cold War, when it really kind of pretty much dropped out of the public mind. And that was understandable in a certain sense because no doubt the political contest that had fueled the arms race and brought the great arsenals into existence had evaporated, and there was a justified sigh of relief. But at the same time, that point of view was a colossal mistake, and that was really so in two ways. And one was that obviously nuclear weapons were about to embark on a period of spreading. The most notable examples were India and Pakistan in 1998, and then we had, following along, North Korea, and now we have Iran maybe in the wings, although it's hard to make a judgment about what they're up to there. And with all kinds of other countries, as I say, with their toes in the water. So in that sense, we are truly at a turning point. But the other way in which it was a colossal mistake has been less noted, and that was that the great nuclear powers decided to hold on to their great arsenals. Indeed, to bring them down, that's very important. That's to be applauded. Reduce the numbers very considerably, really. It's very good. But on the other hand, they held on to this doctrine and the hardware to go with it that we've been discussing already, which is deterrence. And that proved to have a sort of adamantine presence in the world. It seemed to be a doctrine that was immune to all political change. So we had a political revolution in which the global quarrel in which nuclear weapons had arisen dissipated, but the weapons themselves continued, and so did this doctrine. And it seems that the message of 1989, whose 20th anniversary that we've just celebrated, the fall of the wall, it just never reached into the strategic precincts. It never filtered into where the missiles sit in the silos and the generals have their fingers on the button still and so on hair trigger alert and all the rest. So we had a situation that was not as dangerous as the Cold War, but one that was certainly a lot more absurd. And that was, if it was already crazy or mad, as we said, to threaten to destroy ourselves and the human species into the bargain because of a political quarrel, a transient political quarrel, how much crazier it is to do that or threaten that, even if at a reduced level, without any such quarrel. So that is crazy beyond belief. And if you can explain that to me, you're a much smarter person than I am, what that's all about. It has to do with momentum. It has to do with this fantastic grip that these weapons seem to have on our mind, kind of as my friend Bob Beltredici, who's here, says, an addiction, maybe down at the bottom of things. We call those arsenals a deterrent, but I like to call them a proliferant, because really what they do actively and positively in the world is to invite into existence other arsenals, and I've just mentioned some examples of the ones that have come into being since the end of the Cold War, and India, Pakistan, North Korea, and so forth. But actually, no one has any right to be surprised that this was the upshot of the end of the Cold War, and the proliferation proceeded then, because the truth of the matter, the full truth, the full ridiculous truth is that people understood, those who looked at it and analyzed it and knew about it from the very start, that this peril was destined to become universal, not only in the sense that it threatens all of life on Earth, but also in the sense that it would arise at every point on the compass, because this science, it's based on scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge's tendency is to spread. It's like the technology for making a TV. It's old technology. And so, in a certain sense, to get all surprised about it shows that our myopia has been even longer lasting than we thought. Let me read you a quotation from Leo Szilard, the scientist who was in the Manhattan Project and then fought against nuclear weapons for the rest of his life. The position of the United States in the world may be adversely, for those who are surprised to discover that terrorists might get hold of nuclear weapons. The position of the United States in the world may be adversely affected by their existence. Clearly, if such bombs are available, it will not be necessary to bomb our cities from the air in order to destroy them. All that's necessary is to place a comparatively small number in major cities and detonate them at some later time. The long coastline, the structure of our society, and the heterogeneity of our population make effective controls of such traffic virtually impossible. So in a sense, what happened with the end of the Cold War and since, and what continues to happen, is that the nuclear dilemma shed what I call its two-power disguise. And it became what it was destined to be from the very beginning, which is, as I say, universal. And so now, really what we are doing, what we are faced with, is this fully mature, or if not quite fully mature, because it can still go a long distance, but this maturing nuclear age, which in a certain sense has now come of age. And we can see that it's no longer a matter of two powers or three or four or five. Really, it's a matter of all powers, including those who have renounced nuclear weapons, because maybe 50 or 60 of those are perfectly capable of it. And that's another kind of proliferation of capability without actually the weapons themselves being built, but you have to take them into account clearly. After all, they already are where we want to be, and so it's a mistake to leave them out of the equation. Anyway, so I think that's just a word or two about where we are in the particular evolution of the nuclear dilemma itself. So let me now say a few words about what's going on at this present moment. And already we mentioned this a little in the back and forth before with Mayor Akiva. And maybe one of the most novel things that's happening and arresting and also very hopeful, but it's also somewhat baffling and confusing, is that we have a right-wing component to the nuclear disarmament movement. That took the form of an article, as many of you will know, or two articles actually, in the Wall Street Journal by former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, former Senator Sam Nunn, all retired gentlemen, and former Secretary of Defense, did I say William Perry? No, Henry Kissinger, the most surprising of them all. I can't get used to it, so I pushed it out of mind. really startling. So that's a little bit like cardinals of the Catholic Church renouncing the Trinity or something like that. It's really the priesthood turning against its own dogma, and and all of that comes out of this very, very surprising thing, which was the abolitionism, real and sincere and very deep, and acted upon, of Ronald Reagan. Now, for those of us who've been in the traditional peace movement, such as I, to find such an ally, if only belatedly, is really very confusing and disorienting, but also very hopeful, because it kind of gets you out in a certain way, or promises to get you out of a certain political ghetto that this issue had been locked in. At least we can hope for that. And actually, I think in part or in connection with that, there's a whole array of activities that have blossomed. A majority of former secretaries of state and defense now favor the abolition of nuclear weapons. We haven't seen anything like this since 1945, the Baruch Plan under President Truman, which of course went nowhere. But then there are all kinds of very moderate sort of NGOs, such as the Henry Stimson Center in Washington, the Carnegie Endowment, and many others that have embraced the idea of abolition and now conducting all manner of studies about how you would get there and what you would do when you were there. There's an outfit called Global Zero, which has, once again, the support of this sort of legion of retired people that has stepped forward, calling for global abolition, and is making a movie sort of somewhat on the model of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth about the nuclear issue. So that's something to look forward to, I think. I hope that's going to be a good movie. I think it will be. I think it's rather interesting, just parenthetically, that the focus of a lot of these rather established efforts is not only on how do you get to zero nuclear weapons, that's a difficult question, but it's not half as difficult as another one, which is how do you stay there? Because when you talk about zero, it's not just for a day. You know, getting to nuclear weapons might take you a decade or 2 decades or whatever the time period would be, but being there is forever. So in other words, it has to be safeguarded. It has to be a very solid thing. It has to be something that has tremendous backing and is very, as people say in the strategic industry, extremely stable. So there's a lot of thought about that going on, and it's quite interesting, and some of it is fresh. And all of this, as I say, is a kind of sea change in the establishment. But then above all is the embrace by President Obama at Prague and then later at the United Nations of the abolition of nuclear weapons as his goal. And but then we might ask, and I'll just go very briefly in here, is that new impetus, especially Obama's embrace, actually reflected in decision-making that is going on in the government departments and so on? And here we have a much more equivocal situation. If we look at the START follow-on, for example, the upper number there, 1,500 to 1,675, that's only 25 warheads below the 1,700 that was the lower limits of the old START treaty. So by a certain measure, that's only 25 better. Maybe that's tendentious. Maybe it's 100 or 200 better, but it's no revolutionary change. And once again, you see this fantastic survival of the deterrence doctrine and all the hardware that goes with it. They can't seem to get it out of their mind. They couldn't even go down to 1,000. If you look at the nuclear posture review, something that's being undertaken mainly in the Pentagon and is mandated by Congress, has to be completed by December. Once again, we don't know what it will say, but I did have a chance to ask some people in Washington, and I asked whether a no first use statement would be considered. That is, that the United States wouldn't be the first to use nuclear weapons, it would only use them in response, and that seemed to be off the table. So there's no use of no first use. So the United States would be, if this turns out to be what happens, and we don't know yet because it hasn't happened, ready to go before the world saying we are ready to use nuclear weapons against states that have not used them against us, and that's according to them a very, very high degree of utility. Well, I won't go down each of the links. I'll just point out that the pots are really boiling, because then we have, after the December deadline for the nuclear posture review, we have Obama's nuclear security summit, so-called, in April. We don't know what that will be. Will it be just about safeguarding fissile materials, or will he get a little more ambitious and start talking about what really matters, which is the linkage between disarmament and nonproliferation? Well, it's not clear yet. And then comes the NPT, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty 5-yearly review conference, which has already been mentioned, where everything will be brought onto the table in one big global powwow. Hard to say. We don't. The policies are unformed. I asked somebody down there in Washington who was supposed to know, who in the Obama administration is carrying the ball on the abolition front for him, and the answer was the president. And there's this sort of a gap, which I'm trying to indicate here, between the vision professed in the speeches and the actual decision-making, which seems to be going along very much as it did before the statement was made. But I don't want to underestimate the importance of that decision. It's all in process. It's all up for grabs, and that is new. And also, Obama has bought into the traditional arms control agenda, and that's good. Continue with the START talks. The CTBT is another comprehensive test ban treaty, and so forth. But if I look at all of this, what I see is these established characters, but not very strong just yet. Wonderful to see all of you out here tonight, to hear Mayor Akiba and everybody on a Friday night. We don't, I think you are aware, have a strong public movement of the kind that we have had at different times in the nuclear age. That's missing. So it's a curious situation. It's a new situation. It has many very hopeful elements. Things that seemed impossible just a few years ago are now before us as opportunities, the Obama statement and all the rest. And I'm hoping that Mayor Akiba's movement and others, including those supported by the organizers of this conference, will mean that we can make his promises real. Well, that brings me to my final subject, and that is the context in which this issue now finds its place. And that context, I submit to you, is new. It is radically new. And if we who have been so long concerned with the nuclear dilemma don't forge the necessary connections, I'm afraid our issue may remain in the shadows. But I think there's an opportunity here. I know, speaking personally, and maybe some of you have felt it too, that there's something a little bit isolating about thinking about this. There's something kind of weird and embarrassing about it. After all, our subject is obscene. It's a little bit like talking about obscenities in public. And after all, nuclear weapons, what they do is unspeakable. When you think of what a nuclear weapon does to a city, or 100 do, to ourselves, to other living things. And how much can you really speak about the unspeakable? How much can you grab people by the collar and say, look, your city is going to be ashes, and so on? People get tired of that after 6 or 7 decades. So there's a problem here. It seems to be very deeply built into the issue. But I think that there's an opportunity now maybe to breach some of that isolation. Of course, when nuclear weapons first burst upon the world, they came without warning. Nobody knew there was a nuclear weapon until it had destroyed all those people in Hiroshima. And that the thing had been used before it was known. So we faced a used weapon. We never had that moment of global decision or even national decision about whether to use it. It was a used thing. That was done. And really it came, with, as far as the world was concerned, sort of without gestation, like Athena springing out of Zeus's head. And it also came up in the context of war, the Second World War, which it's supposed to have ended, but actually it didn't, but that's another story. And that war became really our sole context, or our major context, for thinking about nuclear weapons. But I would submit to you that on the contrary, the nuclear weapon really didn't have that much to do with war. Rather, it precipitated a crisis for war. And because it really made great power wars impossible. You could fight, you could use the things, but then you would get a result that has nothing to do with war, which was mutual assured destruction, which is just the end of everything. It wouldn't be a war at all. So they transcended war. They escaped the war categories in which we first tried to think about this new things. And it seems to me that only recently has it become clear what the deeper and more fundamental nature and meaning of the weapons is. And I think that we can now see that the bomb was a major part, but only part, of a revolutionary alteration of the relationship of human beings to the planet we live on. I wrote a book called The Fate of the Earth about what nuclear weapons do to us and trying to think about all of that way back in 1982. But only now does that title really come into its own, because it's clear that human activity threatens to mutilate or destroy the natural order on which humans and all forms of life depend for survival. And the threat, of course, is many-sided. It encompasses global warming, overuse of such basic planetary resources as energy, land, groundwater, fish, plants, you name it. It affects land, air, and sea, which we now understand to be an interdependent whole, with the health, for example, of soil and sea depending completely on the health of the atmosphere and vice versa. And really, the arrival of the atomic bomb in 1945 was the first announcement of these new relationships, when scientists realized that the global ecological effects of nuclear war, including nuclear winter, ozone loss, and radiation, put the existence of the human species at risk of self-slaughter. And we had a recent reminder of this, by the way, when the writer at MIT, Alan Robach, and others, scientists, used some of the most recent climate models developed for global warming to study what would happen if India and Pakistan were each to destroy a certain number of cities in a nuclear war. And they discovered that there would be so much particulate matter lofted into the atmosphere that you'd get a kind of mild nuclear winter affecting agriculture over the entire Earth. It was an amazing fact. That's 1 or 200, but actually there are some 20,000 plus nuclear weapons in the world. But we don't think they'll be used. We hope they won't be, but they could be. But anyway, I think one reason, therefore, that we didn't see this larger context was that we didn't have an environmental thinking yet. Rachel Carson came along in 1961, I think it was. But now that full range of threats, or some of them, because there are probably ones in the wings that we don't know about, they seem to come along every 6 or 7 years. You remember the ozone loss danger from chlorofluorocarbons. That one proved rather easier to address than the carbon problem and the others, but it was part of this history. In its report of 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated that with a likely rise in global temperatures of 2.5 degrees, and now scientists are saying it's more likely to be 4 or 5 centigrade, we're speaking, 11 or 12 Fahrenheit, a staggering 40 to 70% of living species on Earth will be placed in peril of extinction by the end of this century. Now, if that isn't a mind-stopping thought, I don't know what is. So nuclear weapons put humanity at risk of extinction, and now we have company in our self-created plight, a lot of it. So if we think of humanity's threat to nature as a Himalayan mountain range, then it was as though when the bomb was born, Mount Everest suddenly thrust itself up out of the plain, and only 50 years later did the other mountains crowd up around it. In other words, nuclear disarmament is only one step, a logical first one, I think, in a much broader agenda imposed by global warming and the multitude of other threats that human beings pose to the biosphere. So I think that what we have to do now, or what my thought about how to proceed, is not to try to revive the old ban the bomb movements of the 60s or the 80s, but a new ban the bomb movement in which our cause, the cause we're discussing tonight, because these others are also equally our cause, is is to find the place for this issue, to assert the place of this issue in the much larger discussion that is now underway. And this may help us, as I would hope, to break out to a certain extent from that peculiar isolation that we have been. Now, really in closing, I'll say one more thing about the relationship of nuclear weapons to that larger agenda. The bomb is the oldest of these threats, so it would make sense for it to be the first to be comprehensively addressed. But obviously, global warming can't wait, so we're going to have to do several things at the same time, and not only those two, but others as well. But I suggest that the nuclear issue has a special significance in this context, that bears not only on the substance of our jeopardy, that is the threat, the danger, but also on the means we'll need to choose to find solutions, not only thus on what the decisions are, but on the way we as a species are going to be making decisions from now on. For surely now we must make decisions as a species. I said that nuclear weapons have little to do with war. They, in fact, disable war. They nail down a lesson that we should have learned without them, that violence is a dead end, and that those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. Thank you. That saying is always worthy of a round of applause as far as I'm concerned, no matter how many centuries we've been saying it. Once that was mainly a spiritual truth, now it is also a tangible one as well. In other words, the bomb pushes us, or perhaps I should say kicks us, in the direction of nonviolence. Am I not right in saying that any fool can see that the rest of the agenda that has been placed before us can't be solved by violence? Someone pointed out to Napoleon that you cannot mine coal with bayonets. Neither can you feed a child with cruise missiles, or protect the ocean with smart bombs, or dispel carbon from the atmosphere with hand grenades, or capture sunlight with tanks. Nuclear abolition will not in itself get us to a world free of war, but it propels us on the way to that goal, which once perhaps was a dream, but now is a necessity. So let's get this one done and bring a world without nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Staying right here,
Sure,
but we're still
sure.
late.